To go, Maggie.
All right, welcome everybody to our final session for UCGIS week. We have a great slate of three presentations lined up for international geographies. I want to thank everybody for being here. It's been a great UCGIS week so far, if I say so myself. And first up, I'm going to introduce Diego from UCLA. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Diego Tamayo. I am a first year Master of Urban and Regional Planning student at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. I am speaking to you all today about a GIS story mapping project that I completed during my ending of the undergraduate career at Pitzer College. I graduated with an environmental analysis bachelor's degree with a minor in political studies, and I put these two emphases to use in creating an ArcGIS story mapping project that I believed fulfilled the intersections of analyzing ecological and built environments through a lens of social and political power. And I found that a lot of these projects may occur within the boundaries of the US, within the large cities, rural areas, and everything in between. However, there are a whole sorts of contexts that are found within projects within nations away from this country. And during my time at Pitzer, I had the privilege of studying abroad in the Yucatan Peninsula, which is a large geographic region of southeastern Mexico, which stretches into Guatemala and Belize, which is currently a major zone of cultural exchange and of rapid economic transformation. There have been Mayan people that have lived here for thousands of years, in addition to more recent Spaniard, Mexican, Middle Eastern mixes of immigrants to the area. And this region has been the site of a massive economic boom, principally in tourism. I found that this site was interesting because of a large project that has been constructed there. And this project is called the Tren Maya. It is a large, massive tourist train project that has been constructed piecemeal in Mexico that has the goal, according to the leadership there, to be this economic engine that would be socially beneficial, sustainably environmentally, and then also just impulse more tourism growth to elevate the economic prosperity of the region because this area of the country has historically been disinvested in. However, I had heard of reports from the news and from folks down in the Yucatan I met personally who had said this project had a whole host of negative impacts and how the positives were being embellished while the negative impacts were being brushed aside. Some of these being deforestation, pollution of groundwater, displacement of indigenous communities, and so forth. Something I found to be very interesting is that a lot of these critiques were focused in rural communities or communities that were in the state of Quintana Roo. That's where Cancun is. That's where a lot of the main tourist presence is. However, I hadn't heard a lot about people talk about specifically the other side of the peninsula, where the city of Mérida exists. This is where I studied abroad. This is a city that has been one of the longest co-inhabited spaces in the entire Western Hemisphere by European peoples. It used to be a mine city called Tho, and then it was settled in the early 1500s. This has been a long-ranging history of colonialism, of power, and it's been built up rapidly within the last few decades. And I found that it was interesting that a lot of news articles discussing the Tren Maya, a lot of the public discourse around it had been omitting this massive city, which has a station, from the conversation. And so I wanted to study how the city has been impacted by this train's arrival, how its built environment has changed, how the people have been affected, how the environment there has been affected. Because as an urban planning student, these are factors extremely important to the practice of determining where our roles are in helping to facilitate projects that help the needs of the community and what they are, and to ensure that we are not upholding systems that oppress and that harm, which unfortunately have been all too prevalent, including in places like Mexico, where disenfranchised communities have been disadvantaged by projects led by the government. And so now I'm going to present to you all the GIS application. When studying the train, the traditional form of the thesis is to say create an essay or perhaps PowerPoint, something that is 2D, something that is stagnant, that can be written. However, I decided that because this is a spatial project, a spatial imposition on the land, there had to be a different way to describe this project because it ultimately is not only an analysis, it's a look through time. And this time frame was fast. This project, spanning over 700 miles, was built in 6 years. Unfathomable in the US because there would have been more potentially lawsuits, environmental reviews, or processes, which would elongate the process to actually build a train. In Mexico, however, these processes were sped up by the government to allow for the project to be done faster. And 6 years is an incredibly short amount of time to have seen all these different changes to the built environment that this train has brought in the entire peninsula and especially in the city of Mérida. And so I found that the GIS story map features with the ability to provide sliding pictures to show before and afters with video capacities, with the ability to include maps in the study, made it all that much richer and actually was able to demonstrate to the reader the value of temporality. And something else that was also extremely helpful with this format was the ability to communicate these findings in multiple languages. I'll show you all later. However, I was able to have this project published in English and Spanish with Mayan Yucateco translations that are audio because this is a mostly spoken language. It does have written text. However, most of the people that speak it have recognition in an auditory way. And so, in order to have this information be accessible, I was able to use the power of the ArcGIS platform to be able to include the audio transcription for the Spanish text, that would be useful for communicating this information to residents of Mérida. Because this here is an informational archive. This is an educational platform ultimately, because this kind of information should not be restricted to the academic planning field. This is something that's important for everyone in that local region to know and those from outside, because ultimately these decisions affect everyone there, no matter how close to the train may be or not. This is something extremely important that I wanted to emphasize and to be able to give back from having my time and space be given to the university over there. So now I'm going to go into the actual analysis itself. This here is basically stretching the ArcGIS platform to the max. There's a whole host of different tabs here discussing different themes of the project. I used the sustainability report to basically, oh, before we continue, here is a map of the project. This here is the city of Mérida up here in the corner. Cancun and all the mostly famous areas are over here. And this basically shows how massive the train is stretching all around the peninsula here. So for the purpose of this study, I'm focusing on this region here. However, if you have heard about the Tren, chances are it's been about one of the parts of the project along this side over here. This here is a history about how the project was created, some information about who rides. However, something I do want to show you all in particular is part of the use of the images. One could talk about urban sprawl, but another showing how in 40 years the city grew from this to this to this. It shows that the current development model is very horizontally sprawling and that a train could potentially help concentrate the sprawl from expanding or maybe build upon it. And so I was able to use this in terms of describing how the train could potentially do this. How could it potentially change the model of it being built, the city's actual landscape? And so here I describe how this was an original route for the train planned to go through the city center, but how eventually it was moved out from the city center to save on costs and to have the project be built more quickly. Because remember, this is 6 years. The government was looking to have this be done so that politically it would look advantageous to say that they got this project done, ribbons cut and everything, without potentially considering the longer term impacts of how they built the train, how the public were consulted. And so that resulted in the consequence of a potential magnet of development, of density of housing being placed so far out of the periphery that that would potentially increase the sprawl of the area and not help keep it concentrated in the middle of the city. And so I was able to use a map to actually demonstrate this alteration to the plan and these real world consequences, I think better than an essay would have. And this is especially important for residents who maybe were not aware of the full planning process, because another issue with creating the train was public transparency. The government was not always upfront in providing this information to residents, or maybe it was during sporadic meetings that were not properly advertised. And so I'm hoping that by sharing this information, people can become more aware of how this project was planned and ultimately um, just take that with them to either just have a better awareness to be more demanding to the city governments, or just to be able to learn and understand like how these decisions have really had impacts on the city. Because by deciding to build a train in the periphery here, the city had to find a way to connect the train to the city center, because ultimately a major planning issue with designing transit is by having stations distant from the city center. So what the city ultimately decided to do, and the federal government, was to basically construct a way to connect the center of the city to the train. And this had impacts on the city at large. It came from remodeling the center plaza in the city to building streets that were entirely remodeled into more of a touristy form to be a inviting walking environment that were then connected to a massive urban park that used to be an old railroad yard, that were then connected to a modern transit system that were using old railroad tracks to then connect all the way to the train station that's now existing in the present day. And folks have been concerned about the impacts of gentrification, of rising land prices, and in some cases, even housing displacement. And so by choosing to build the train station outside of the city, this entire corridor, which you all have seen, is now being subjected to these same changes of increasing modernization, of rising prices, of increased tourism interest. And so the reason why I'm ultimately here today is to share how powerful the ArcGIS story map format is with being able to create not only create narrative telling methods, but to just create information in a way that can be accessible to people, whether it's on the phone, laptop, with any Wi-Fi connection, and just to be communicated in a way that breaks down the ivory tower of academia. That is why I followed through with creating the project in the way that I did. And that's why I plan on sharing this with the university down south, why I will be sharing this with people to ensure that this resource can be distributed as it should be. Does anyone have any immediate questions right now before I end the session? I do understand that there is a larger Q&A at the end, but just if anyone's curious, I'll be willing to open up the floor for anything quick.
I think very, very quickly before we get into the more elaborate Q&A at the end, roughly how long does it take for people to get from this train station outside of the city to the city center? Do you know by any chance?
So the actual tram to get to the park takes about 40 to 50 minutes or so. And then actually getting to the city center would require usually a cab or an Uber or Didi or something that takes another 10 to 12. And so the consequences of building more cheaply on the outside are very notable for people trying to use the train. That's been a major obstacle in it being more popular with travelers and locals alike. So yes, the decisions on paper do have long-term consequences.
Wow, very interesting. And I know I have some questions for when we get to the end of our session. So thank you very much for that, Diego. Round of applause for that. Next up, I'm going to introduce Devanshi of UC Riverside.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. First things first, my computer broke down the very last minute, so I'm using my peer's computer under whose her name is Eileen Luna, and I'm having trouble changing the name right now. But I am Devanshi, just using Eileen's computer. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here really quick. Okay. Can everybody see this? Is this visible to all?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So there was a great presentation, Diego, by the way, and this is going to kind of shift a little bit of gears because I will now be talking a little bit more about spatial clustering and spatial geographical issues, but on a more of a stereotypical way. So I'm going to talk about cross-cultural variations, skin tone preferences, skin tone biases. So let's get started. Before I begin, I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk a little bit about me, just kind of to help you guys understand where my passion towards this research comes from. So I'm born and brought up in India, this country rich in culture, tradition, and even its history. While it's so diverse and has so many traditions, since its independence, India has managed to accommodate a lot of biases in different ways and forms. We have gender biases, age biases, but we also have skin tone biases, which kind of have different connotations compared to the Western world. So when I first moved to the US in 2018 for my further studies, I thought that these biases were only prevalent or only there in India, right? Like I thought I was leaving them behind and I was going to kind of now adapt to the new culture that I was entering into. So when I was crossing borders, I thought that I'll be now adapting to the new culture and learning new things and also, getting a better understanding of the biases that are in my immediate environment. But what fascinated me more was that my thoughts, my decision, my behavior was always kind of influenced by the biases that I did carry from India, which really made me realize the impact of culture and the geography that we really come from and we belong to, right? Which started making me think that do people carry these biases when they move from one place to another or when they move beyond borders? So far in the research that we have in the social cognition literature says that there are kind of two ways to really explain the role of culture. The first thing is that all the learnings that we have are through our culture, they're embedded within us, right? They are there since the development and they kind of stay with us throughout a while. But then there's also another idea that says that as the environment changes, so do our biases. Our minds just tend to naturally connect to our existing biases or racism that we are seeing in our immediate geographies. And it helps us, so both of these ideas together to kind of create the personality that we are right now. But let me first answer the larger question before I move for a dig deeper is what are biases? Biases are these tendencies or inclinations that people can have that affect how we think or we feel or we behave towards a certain group, a community, or an individual. Now, there are two kinds of biases. The first is explicit biases. These are biases are something that we are aware about. We know its ongoing impact, something that we openly talk about. We also have implicit biases. These are something that we're not really aware about. We don't know we have them. Let's say that even you come to a realization point that, okay, I have such an implicit bias I did not know about. Its impact on you might still be out of your control. And that's how it is. That's the beauty of it. They're implicit in nature. Uh, Now, there are a lot of types of biases, as I mentioned before, but today I will be solely focusing on the skin tone biases. So what is skin tone biases? It's mostly studied in the Western societies thus far. It's also called as colorism, which is basically giving preferential treatment to light-skinned people of color relative to darker skin tone individuals in different sectors such as income, education, criminal justice, sentencing, law, or even housing. While this awareness is quite widespread amongst the Black community, it's also very prevalent and important concern among Latinos and even Asian Americans. So my aim was to try kind of understand this globally, which there's a little bit of limitation right now in the current literature. So there's already some kind of research done before to understand skin tone preferences or biases. And there was a study conducted in 2021 that did show that we see this cultural or this geographical variations that tells us that every culture, what you bring with you, your culture values and your biases that differ. Which brings me to my first hypothesis is that A skin tone bias in individuals residing in their home country, right? So let's say an Italian who's residing in Italy is basically been compared with an Italian residing in the United States. So we're trying to compare their skin tone biases in an individual residing in the US from the same home country. Other simple example would be I'm not a US citizen, I'm here, I'm an Indian living in the US, and let's say we compare my biases with my mother, who's an Indian living in India right now. So I also wanted to understand what predicts these geographical or cultural variations that we are seeing spatially, so that I decided to research on three different predictors. Our first predictor is socioeconomic disparities, which is a very significant part of the status of a nation. It tells us the differences in wealth, income, and social status in a given country. So my second hypothesis is that more the socioeconomic disparity in a given country, lesser the biases that we will notice. My third hypothesis and my second predictor was religious orthodoxy. Religious orthodoxy plays a very crucial role in influencing intergroup biases. It basically means following established and traditional or adhering to fixed rules and regulations when it comes to religion or religiosity. There are so many societies, such as Hinduism, that has portrayed lighter skin tone as traditionally and associated with purity or beauty or higher social status. So, which brings me to my third hypothesis, more the religious orthodoxy in a given country, more the skin tone biases that we will notice. My final predictor and my final hypothesis is cosmopolitanism. A country who is high on cosmo basically says that they are more willing to embrace new ideas. They are willing to accept and respect new cultures. And that also means that they foster more empathy, more acceptance. However, we also have some contrasting ideas about cosmopolitanism. With the same concept in mind, our final hypothesis is more the cosmo country is, lesser the skin tone biases that we will see geographically. All right, moving to the fun part, the methods now. To better understand the skin tone biases, we relied on Project Implicit. This is a very great initiative which is actually comparatively quite recent, where if you log on to it, or any individual is able to take different tests to kind of see if you have any implicit biases or what sort of implicit biases you might have. Keep in mind, this is not like a measure of if somebody is racist or prejudiced. It's just to see that we might have these biases that we are not even aware about. So some of these examples of are career biases, right? That tells us that do you associate men with more STEM courses or STEM related careers rather than women? And women with more household related roles. So that's an example of the kind of IIT tests that they have. The one that we collected the data from was from Skin Tone IIT. That measures both the implicit as well as the explicit measures. We had participants from across 80 countries with minimum of 100 observations each. And also, yes, importantly, we had some exclusion criteria. That was that participant needed to be at least 18 years of age. They were asked to provide the demographic information such as age, gender, ethnicity. They also indicated the country that they held a primary citizenship. This was important because, like I mentioned, we only took participants who were non-US citizens. This is a quick example or like how it looks. So there's the IIT. So we have some positive words, negative words, and these are the silhouettes that are utilized for the IIT. Of course, keep in mind they have updated in the past year. So here's an example, right? So it's how quickly do you associate the two? How quickly do you associate the positive words or the negative words with the kind of skin tone that you see on the screen? And here is some example of the self-report. Questions such as, I strongly prefer dark-skinned people to light-skinned people, all the way up to I strongly prefer light-skinned people to dark-skinned people. For each of the predictors, we had three different indicators that we used, right? So for socioeconomic status, religion, and cosmo, and they were taken from online available or secondary data analyses. They were collected from Gini Index, World Value Survey, United Report. We had about data for 195 countries on an average, and then also we conducted the range of the years span from 1945 all the way to 2022. And I will now be talking about the results really quickly. So this is the fun part. The first thing that we see is we see the spatial evidence that cross-cultural variations do exist. So allow me to walk you through this really quick. We see two maps here. We see the explicit and then we see the implicit here. So the more greener means that that country has lower levels of biases. The purpler, if that's a word, that it gets, then they have higher levels of biases. So for an example, I'm going to, of course, target India one more time here. So if you could really quickly take a look at the explicit skin tones, we see that India is green. So the self-report is they don't have biases, but then it turns dark purple when we see that implicitly. Lastly, we also did hierarchical multi-level modeling where age, gender, education, and self-rated skin tone was taken into account. What we see is that your individual traits that matter more. So males tend to have more biases than female. Older people have more biases than younger people. Education was not a factor here. And then we also see that, which was the most prominent one, was that darker skin tone individuals have lesser biases in general. But we did not see, when we accounted for the predictors, we did not see any significance going on here, which are the red circles that we see. We saw same results for explicit as well, but here men portraying more biases compared to females was a higher predicting value. All right, so that brings me to my conclusion. So we see some evidence of culture. We also see that how much for the predictors, we see that the individual traits that matter more. So your age matters more, the gender, and then this research just adds to the long-running conversation by showing how widespread and deep-rooted these preferences are even today. While we only tested for 3 predictors, we can also test this for other predictors. There could be a longitudinal study. But this study does not claim to explain everything, but it certainly gives a meaningful piece to a larger story. And it says that how things change when you move from one border to another. So migration also plays a very important role here. All right, please allow me to thank my wonderful team. This study was conducted at San Diego State University for my master's. I would like to thank Dr. Thierry Divos and all my colleagues at the Intergroup Relations Lab. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Devanshi. That was very interesting. And just a reminder, please feel free to put questions in the chat as they come to mind. And next up is Monica from UC Santa Cruz. Take it away.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Let me just share my screen real quick. It's don't want to be at the end yet. Yeah, so in the hunt for a good title, clearly we thought of the same thing, Devanshi. Those alliterations really do hit. But yeah, so what my project is also looking at things beyond singular countries. So I'm looking at the impacts of a plastic waste ban in Indonesia. So let's get started. So I'm going to first quickly talk about your motivation, contribution, context, and whatnot. This is an ongoing project, so I'm going to focus more on like the motivation and context sort of information. So what is the global landscape for plastic waste? So global plastic generation has surged dramatically over recent decades. I'm sure many of us have realized that a lot of the stuff that we consume in these as a high-income country comes in plastic. We as high-income countries often don't have the capacity to deal with our own plastic waste or the waste we generate. So it is usually exported to low middle income countries. However, these low middle income countries often have poor waste disposal practices and less stringent environmental regulations. And this usually leads to the release of noxious gas from, the noxious air pollutants from incinerations and open air pits, leakage of microplastics into aquatic ecosystems and even into your food. And it also disrupts livelihoods from just the sheer mass of dumping and accumulation that happens. So when we're looking at plastic waste and specifically the trade of plastic waste, Southeast Asia has become sort of this hotspot for plastic. So this is just an example from a recent news article that I had found, just showing the sheer volume of plastic waste that is present. And this is a lot sure there is domestic production, but there is also a lot of imported plastics. In Indonesia itself, like recently, there are over 1,000 kilotons of plastic that are imported into the country. So before I talk about my own contribution, I just want to talk about a little bit about what sort of work has been going on in this area. So there are two main strands of literature. One looks at this idea of pollution leakage or redistribution across borders. So oftentimes regulation will push polluting activity from one area to another. One example of this is the US tightening of lead standards. There's a fair amount of papers that actually look at the movement of like battery recycling facilities from the US to Mexico and what impacts this had. There are also papers that claim this redistribution is not always a negative, but can also be a positive, and which was the case under NAFTA when you imports of cars into Mexico increased from the US, taking off the road older cars in Mexico. And yes, the cars were still old, the ones coming from the US, but they were of better, like, they were of better ability than other ones. And then with respect to the policy, which I will talk about in a second, a lot of the effects, the policy that I'm going to look at, a lot of the effects that have been examined really look at China, which was the implementing country. So it looks a lot of papers look at just sheer volume of waste and the value of waste that's coming into the country. High income country, so how this waste policy disrupted and displaced exports and what impacts it's had on domestic recycling. And trade flows, such as just this movement to Southeast Asia and this idea of waste havens. So this paper, this project specifically, is looking at how the surge in plastic waste imports driven by the national sword policy affects air pollution in Indonesia. So I use this Chinese national sword as an external shock to sort of look at how um, the impacts within Southeast Asia. So I can trace increases in imported plastic to local air pollution responses. And then the contribution this makes is that it provides this causal evidence on how redirected waste imports or this idea of a domestic environmental policy might negatively or positively just understanding the overall welfare impacts associated with these policies beyond that single country's border. And then I'm also documenting the cross-border pollution that's driven by this waste. So the national sword policy was implemented by China, but prior to its implementation, China actually imported over 50% of the world's plastic that was intended for recycling. Um, there were raising concerns of environmental and health externalities like pollution, groundwater contamination, as well as like hazardous working conditions. So the Ministry of Environmental Protection imposed this rule on January 2018, that restricted the importation of certain categories of goods. And these goods that I'm going to be looking at include plastic waste and unsorted paper because they are very intertwined in when they're being sent from one country to another, as well as some textiles and this metal runoff. One thing to note is the reason that China was able or sort of took on this burden of importing so much of the global plastic was this rapid industrialization and movement of goods and products. So when we're looking just at import data from high consumption countries, and we compare what happened in 2018. So this is monthly data that I've taken from the UN Comtrade, and you can see basically down to the month when imports started increasing with respect to these HS codes that we're looking at. So China observed a decrease of around 90%, and um, Indonesia increased Indonesia's increase doubled when looking at high consumption countries. But the magnitude of this is also is the proportion of increase is very similar when looking at all imports, just the magnitude is substantially bigger. So instead of having a peak at around 400 kilotons, we're actually looking at a volume of closer to 1,200. So I've just focused on high consumption countries just for the sake of storytelling, but it's there. So the data sources is where I've sort of used been able to exploit some of these GIS tools and maps. So there are four data sources that I use. To identify waste sites, I use this Minderoo Foundation's Global Plastic Watch, which is a machine learning model that um, uses satellite data to identify informal waste dumps. So a lot of these waste locations are not just landfills, they're open pits or dumps that have come. I've also been able to scrape sea and container ports, and then import data, as well as these monthly measures of PM 2.5 from the Washington Atmospheric Composition Analysis Group. So when we're talking about waste sites, where are they in Indonesia? So there are around 373 that were identified using this machine learning model. These darker blue points are pre-existing waste sites. So these waste sites existed before the ban. And then following the ban, because this was like an ongoing project, around 120 new sites were observed following the policy. I'm actually working on trying to improve what they've done here with a couple of other collaborators, and because this is, is really a low bar of how many waste sites there are in Indonesia. A lot of the waste sites also overlap with, as expected, more urban areas, which is why the island here with Java, Jakarta, and Bali has the most. When it comes to waste imports and ports, there are 21 deep sea ports and terminals, and then the shading in this figure correlates to the quantity of waste that's imported into the country. So this is the log of imports. So, Jakarta, this is the state of Jakarta, and they import the most. So this follows very closely with deep sea terminals. So I'm hoping to use this idea that I can somewhat track where waste is going within the country. Waste is not a high value good, but it is used in certain industries. So trying to compare more urban areas across near deep sea ports, or provinces with deep sea ports might give me some other variation, and I'll talk about that later. And then just looking at pollution levels, so the average pre-policy pollution, I have dropped the fire season because Indonesia is known to have large forest fires, and I think in 2015 there was a very, very big one. Um, and they do, like these forest fires also correlate with the time of burning of palm trees and palm oil. So I have taken out these 3 months of the year, but with beyond that, I've averaged out the average pollution pre-policy. Um, so this is from 2015 to 2017. And then this is the average pollution following the policy for just 2018 and 19. I didn't go beyond 2019 because we all know what happened in 2020. COVID did, and this really did impact shipping, especially in the first couple of quarters of 2020. So how do I identify this effect? So the first thing that I'm doing is I'm exploiting both spatial and temporal variation to run this DID, or difference in difference specification, where I'm trying to compare areas that were close to these identified waste sites pre-policy and post-policy. So the pollution is just, given that I'm looking at satellite data, I do have cell level pollution measures. So this is like a 1 by 1 kilometer grid. And I've identified bins by which distance is defined. So for a DID to be valid, one thing you have to confirm is that in the absence of the policy, these areas near and far from waste sites would follow similar pollution trends. So one way to check this parallel trends assumption, or check the plausibility, I should say, is to verify or examine the parallel trends in the pre-period. So if we look at the area from like the zero time period, which is January of 2015, to this dotted line, which is the end of 2017, you can see that there is variation month by month, quarter by quarter of when and the level by which pollution is, but following the policy, following the time period, all of these bins, which just vary in distance from a waste site, follow the same rough level. So like they all sort of increase at the same time. Um, and then there are levels that are really no distinction, no different to the very, very far group. Versus when we look at the post policy, which we will see in like my actual results, but when we look here, there is some deviations in trying to observe what are the impacts pre and post, what are the impacts between these groups and these kilometer differences. So when you do run the specification, what you get is, sorry, this table is mixed up. The bottom two labels should be switched. But what you do find is that areas that are closer to a waste site post policy do observe statistically significant increases in micrograms per meter cubed of PM2.5 concentrations. So in this case, following the introduction of the policy, PM2.5 increased by more than 7% in areas near waste sites compared to those further away, which the comparison group is all the way around 40 to 43 kilometers. And the reason I have these somewhat arbitrary cutoffs is one, just power to actually run anything. This is already a sample of around 6 million. So I did run analyses to pick which cutoffs would be the best. But an alternative specification, because one of the questions that I always get is how do you deal with the question that most of these, not most, but many of these waste sites might not be getting imported waste. So how can we confirm or examine this? So what I'm currently exploring is this relationship between being near a waste site and a port. So this is near is actually supposed to be the port. So when we look at what I've done here is I've subset the sample to only include cells that are within 3 kilometers of a waste site and near any deep sea port. So I'd identified around 23 deep sea ports in the previous figures that I'd showed about context. So looking at these and the waste trading information to see where waste is going. So if waste sites were within 50 kilometers of a port that receives waste, they are indicated with a 1, or these are considered my treated cells, versus the ones that did not. So what we do find is that there is an increase in PM2.5 if they're close to a port that received waste. But we also do find an increase in PM2.5 post policy. However, when we look at the interaction or are trying to identify the effect strictly for those post policy and receive waste, the effect size does decrease substantially. It's like less than 1% of the overall pollution levels. So what we find is that like this is what I'm working on right now and trying to integrate wind data into this analysis because shipping containers are very large and they have produced a lot of pollution. So what I, yeah, 1 minute left. So what I want to talk about is just the fact that following the introduction of this policy, we do find that waste flows into Indonesia increased. We also do see that being near a port increases pollution. However, this interaction is not like strongly significant. It's quite a noisy positive. So in order to address this, I'm looking at incorporating wind direction into the model, as well as conducting potential differences in triple difference models to make sure that the treatment effect that I'm estimating is more relevant to the policy question at hand. Yeah, so this is the thing. Yeah, sorry.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's give a big round of applause to both Monica and all three of our great speakers from this session. I want to open up the floor to questions. I haven't spotted any in the chat yet. I know I have a couple questions, but I want to make sure everyone has a chance to ask what's on their mind. And actually, if all of our speakers from today could turn their cameras on, I think that would be helpful. So I'll start with a question I have for Diego about your presentation on the Tren Maya. I know I already asked about sort of what that time looks like getting from that external station into the city center. I really just want to, so I work as a map librarian at UCLA, and I talk a lot about pedagogy with geospatial resources. I loved everything that you had to say about the importance of basically being able to make your scholarship public, especially with your translations. It's something we've been trying to work on in the UCLA library in terms of our resources. It's starting to get them translated into Spanish and hopefully other languages down the line. Uh, I'm curious if like education or sort of other pedagogical fields or something that you're interested in being able to go into in the future. I know you said you're a first year graduate student, but I really see this passion that you have for more accessible pedagogy and public scholarship. And I'm curious if that's something you're interested in working on more in the future.
Thank you for that question. And besides, the other two presentations were also really fantastic. The research on biases and plastic was really fascinating. Great presentations, you know. But to answer your question now, I don't believe that that is a key interest of mine directly. It's more so, I think, a way of engaging with the practice I'm already doing with urban planning. I think it's just like that nature of needing to be publicly accessible that I think is motivating it. However, I do think that this is a great example that maybe someone could use to show how to be demonstratable in that sense, because I do agree that, to your point, that it could be used for, say, public education. And so, yeah, I don't think that'd be exactly my place to take up, but I think that the Story ArcGIS Story Map platform is a fantastic resource for that public education and should be used more.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And for the recording, I'll read this question from Liam in the chat out loud. It's for Monica. Liam says, really interesting work in use of satellite pollution data. I wonder if there have been any challenges working with the scale of the PM 2.5 data, 1 kilometer, question mark, and the fact that sites may be closer than 1 kilometer to one another. And does this factor into the analysis?
Yeah, so I basically have defined a radius around each way site right now. And then if they're within that radius, they just get a one. I am reading on how to incorporate this like a weighting factor because cells that are close to multiple waste sites will obviously be more treated than others. So how do I define more of a continuous treatment variable is definitely something that I'm trying to incorporate into the analysis. If you
Thank
have any
you.
suggestions, let me know.
And I'm curious, this is sort of a twofold question. I'm curious if this is something that I don't know if you are familiar with researchers doing similar work in other Southeast Asian countries. I know you mentioned that, especially since China enacted that policy in 2018, that many Southeast Asian nations are seeing an uptick in imported waste. And also, sort of in line with that, are you seeing things like on the ground in Indonesia to potentially make attempts to change this policy to reduce the amount of imported waste?
Yeah, so the first is not with respect to this exact policy. There's nothing else that really looks at it from the receiving country side or where this, Chinese domestic policy impacted a different country. So that's what I'm trying to do. I am hoping to also extend this analysis a little bit to do more of an accounting exercise of pollution, because Chinese pollution did decrease. China also has better environmental standards at the time of this policy. And then they were redirected to countries that had worse environmental standards. So this might have been an environmental policy, but global welfare might not have been benefited. With respect to local efforts. There are actually a lot. So I've engaged with a fair few amount of NGOs to talk to about what they are doing and how they're observing it. There's very interesting efforts in place, like mailing waste back to what are they called? Consulates in the country to be like, look, like you are sending waste, like you need to address this problem. And then there's also more of regional coordination that's happening. So there's a lot of like UN bodies on like waste that are actually more prominent in trying to create like regional treaties because waste is a big problem in the region.
Excellent. That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Do we have other folks with questions for our speakers? Unfortunately, it looks like we've lost Devanshi, but we still have Monica and Diego here to answer questions. I guess if there are no further questions, with that, I want to direct folks to the link that Danielle just put in the chat to our post-event survey. This is our final session for UCGIS Week 2025. I have to say, I think it's been a very successful one. I can't even count how much I've learned this week. So many excellent presentations from all of our speakers. And actually, this is the most presenters we've ever had for UCGIS Week, which is also super exciting. Thank you all. I know lots of you were here for many of our sessions this week. Uh, Thank you again. Please provide your feedback. It really helps us from year to year, making UCGIS Week better. And the other thing as well is we hope to get our recordings up to our UCGIS Week YouTube page as soon as possible, hopefully by early next week at the latest. And we will send an email to all registrants with a link once the recordings are available. So you'll know when they're up and you'll be able to share with anybody in your circles. And with that, I bid everybody a farewell and a happy GIS week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.